Out Caesar, out Nolus, Emperor of the world.
Charlie Chaplin was a divinity. He owned the world.
He was the first universal artist that I can think of. Chaplin was probably the most popular person, entertainer, however you want to say, on the planet.
The thing about Chaplin that made me lean toward him was the ambience he gave, the sort of free-floating feeling about someone who could circumvent nature.
My reaction to Great Dictator is so hard to talk about because I laughed so hard and was so deeply moved.
Here was this huge artist standing up against this gargantuan monster. It was a championship match for the ages.
To me, it was one of the finest films I'd ever seen. When you were faced by the totalitarian regimes and the madness they inflicted on the world, courage isn't enough. You have to be able to laugh in their face, throw back your head and say, "You don't count. I discount you this way. I give you the laugh of all time, the great laugh of acceptance, which melts you down."
A remarkable new discovery in the Chaplin Villa at Vevey, Switzerland. In the film vault are the famous comedies, The Gold Rush, City Lights, which are known to the entire world. What was not known lay in the cellar for decades. 2 suitcases belonging to Sidney Chaplin, Charlie's brother, full of curious little boxes which turned out to contain amateur film. Chaplin shot his film in black and white, but this footage takes us behind the scenes in color. It adds another dimension to an extraordinary story, the confrontation between Adolf Hitler and Charlie Chaplin through the making of a highly controversial motion picture released in 1940 called The Great Dictator. Charlie Chaplin, the little tramp, and Adolf Hitler, the leader of Germany, had more in common than just a moustache. They were born in the same week of the same month of the same year. A few years before Chaplin became famous as the tramp, Hitler was a tramp. Both were outsiders who left their homeland to conquer the world. They became the best loved and most hated men of their time. In every country, Chaplin was the symbol for laughter. Hitler, the symbol for destruction. His war cost 55 million lives. But in the 1930s, he seemed unstoppable. World leaders sought to appease him. Most of Hollywood chose to ignore him. But one voice would speak to millions. One man would have the courage to challenge the world's most dangerous leader, Charlie Chaplin. The climax of The Great Dictator. Chaplin's Jewish barber is mistaken for the dictator and is called upon to speak.
Excellency, the world awaits your word.
Chaplin had never spoken on the screen until he made this film. But he felt if he could talk from his heart, he might even be able to shorten the war. What was it that would bring Chaplin and Hitler into such a unique confrontation? Chaplin was born in 1889 in the South London slums he would recreate so often in his films. His father was a music hall singer, as was his mother. Because of her mental trouble, Charlie and his brother were sent to the workhouse. Working people were terrified of this fate, which Chaplin vividly conveyed in The Kid, when the law comes to take the child to the workhouse. Chaplin escaped into the theatre, became a music hall comedian, and sailed on his first tour to America in 1910. Hitler came from a lower middle-class family at the border of Austria and Germany. He hated school and learned very little, but was always a ringleader. His father was a brutal man, a customs officer who had married one of his servants. Hitler's mother was probably the only woman Hitler ever loved. She protected him from his father. As soon as he could, he went to Vienna, where he hoped to become an artist. The young Hitler refused to do any work other than drawing, but he was considered no better than competent. His failure in the entrance exam for the Vienna Academy devastated him. How different history might have been had Adolf Hitler been accepted. He lost his self-respect and sank lower and lower into the slums of old Vienna. He became a tramp, sleeping rough. This Vienna men's home probably saved his life. It was supported partly by Jewish charities. But from such men as Guido von List, Hitler soaked in hatred of the Jews. List preached the superiority of the Aryan. His symbol would become Hitler's. Munich, 1st of August 1914. A cheering crowd celebrates the outbreak of war. The scene is recorded by a photographer, and among the crowd he's photographing is the 25-year-old Adolf Hitler. It is not often one sees the birth of a legend. This crowd takes no notice of the tramp on his first appearance in public in 1914. A year later, he would be mobbed wherever he went. 2 years later, he would be the most famous man in the world. February 1916, Chaplin signs with the Mutual Film Corporation for the highest salary of any performer in history, standing behind Sidney Chaplin. Hitler was earning 9 marks a week at the front, but he loved the war. It gave him a sense of purpose. And he was still an artist. He designed this facade for a soldier's cinema. Hitler had avoided the Austrian army because of his passion for Germany. His supreme commander, the Kaiser, is fuming with jealousy over Chaplin's popularity in this wartime cartoon. Charlie captured the Kaiser at the end of Shoulder Arms. The Chaplin films did more than any others to raise morale. "20 years later, Chaplin would restage World War I for The Great Dictator, picking up where Shoulder Arms left off, wearing German uniform.
Big Bertha, a cannon that could hurl a projectile 100 miles, was this day to make its first appearance on the Western Front, was this day to strike terror into the hearts of the enemy. 75 miles away was her target, the Cathedral of Notre Dame. And clear! Ready! Fire!
He was the little guy who, they loaded it up and then he had to pull this string that fired it. And he had such a funny way of doing it that watching this, I screamed with laughter and it ruined the take. And he was delighted, my father. I thought he'd be furious. God, that cost me a fortune, and he loved it.
He became a worldwide figure during the First World War, while the German submarines were sinking convoys of ships. Somehow, his films were circulating around the world. It's as if there were special convoys just to take Chaplin films to Europe.
Before stupendous crowds all over the United States, Chaplin took part in Liberty Bond rallies. Many people criticized him for not joining up, but these rallies brought in huge sums for the war effort. He appeared with Mary Pickford and Douglas Fairbanks, with whom he would form United Artists. Here, together with D.W. Griffith, they announced their independence. This gave Chaplin complete artistic freedom. By now, the war was over. A gas attack at the end of 1918 had put Hitler into hospital. While convalescing, he had heard of the defeat of the German army on the Western Front. He felt utterly betrayed. He had no job to go to, so, like so many, he stayed in the army. The revolutions of 1919 and 1920 propelled Hitler into the Nazi Party. 1921, Chaplin returns to London for the first time. The city he knew as a poverty-stricken youth gave him a phenomenal welcome. But for Hitler, in Germany, conditions were appalling. An economic collapse when a loaf of bread cost 1 billion marks created ideal conditions for extremists. Hitler joined his old commander, General Ludendorff, in an attempt to seize power, the Munich Putsch of 1923. It landed him in jail, where he dictated his political ideas into a book. Among the men who inspired him was the Italian fascist dictator Benito Mussolini.
Fascism in the 20s was regarded with a certain admiration. Mussolini seemed to be cleaning out the marshes, suppressing the mafia, getting the trains to run on time. Mussolini particularly impressed businessmen.
The Wall Street crash of 1929 undermined the world's financial markets. Without it, Hitler could never have reached power. It brought chaos back to Germany and convinced many that democracy did not work. Germany was falling into anarchy. Political street fights happened every day. The communists fought the Nazis. Everyone fought the police. People looked for a strong leader. Hitler knew the value of film, but audiences did not respond to him as a silent actor.
I remember seeing a silent newsreel of Hitler and thinking suddenly, this man looks absolutely ridiculous, and just like Chaplin would look if he were playing such a part.
Hitler's fortunes were transformed by sound, launched in America 2 years earlier by a film made, ironically, by Jews about Jews. The talking picture increased his audiences and made them take Hitler seriously.
Und ich glaube nicht, dass die Gegner, die damals noch gelacht haben, heute auch noch lachen.
Er ist eindeutig als Redner an die Macht gekommen. Stück für Stück und immer mehr, und die Begeisterung wurde immer größer. Er hat sich ja immer mehr perfektioniert. Er hat sich ja dann auch sehr bemüht. Er hat ja zum Beispiel auch zwischendurch mal Schauspielunterricht genommen, weil er diese Wirkung verstärken wollte.
Chaplin was even more dependent on gesture. He carried on making silent pictures until he made The Great Dictator, when he played Adenoid Hinkle.
Genau, die Welt stürzt mit zerfällten sagt. Ah, und die Aryan Maiden. Ah, die Aryan Maiden. Die Delikatessen mit der Schön. Und der Flachsen mit der Stresses. Ah, und der Ulstein mit der Muss. Der Muss von der Kinder Katzenjammer. Der Katzenjammer mit der guten Sekt, der hinten, feiten, dotten, guten Sekt. Hey, soldiers for Hinkle!
Well, he was a marvelous imitator, and he could do almost any language. just by the sound of it. They had a newsreel theater there on Hollywood Boulevard, only newsreels, which my father adored. Instead of seeing some movie that was lousy, we'd go and see an hour and a half or 2 hours of newsreels. And that's where you'd see most of this.
Chaplin considered Hitler one of the greatest actors he had ever seen.
Wenn wir selbst dieses deutsche Volk emporführen durch eigene Arbeit, durch eigenen Fleiß, eigene Entschlossenheit, eigenen Trotz, eigene Beharrlichkeit, dann werden wir wieder emporsteigen, genau wie die Väter einst auch Deutschland nicht geschenkt erhielten, sondern selbst schaffen mussten. Der Schuten. Und das trifft das Sauerkraut mit der Schuten. Und der Leberwurst mit der Schuten. Der Flipsensack Alter mit der Schuten. Der Flipsensack der Klärten. Das Strängelichen mit der Hultensack der Fläten. Und der Blätzensack der Elten. Besick! Besick! Der Schuten. Der Schuten.
His Excellency has just referred to the Jewish people.
Chaplin would also play a Jewish barber, whose girlfriend in the film and his wife in real life was Paulette Goddard, who was half Jewish.
How'd you do it?
The Nazis were convinced that Chaplin was a Jew. Chaplin never denied it.
No. I absolutely thought he was Jewish. First of all, because of the way I was brought up, everybody funny was Jewish.
On his visit to Berlin in 1931, he was met by rapturous crowds. The Nazis hated seeing a man they thought was a Jew welcomed like this.
Wir wussten, dass ein Jude war, nicht wahr? Das wussten wir. Und das war natürlich für uns nicht das, was wir wollten. Und wir wussten auch, dass er uns nicht lieben konnte und nicht geliebt hat. Und dass er großen Einfluss hatte.
The Nazis would later use these newsreels of Chaplin's visit in their most notorious propaganda film.
Der Jude Chaplin wurde bei seinem Besuch in Berlin von einer begeisterten Menge begrüßt. Es lässt sich nicht leugnen, ein Teil des deutschen Volkes applaudierte damals ahnungslos den zugewanderten Juden, den Todfeinden seiner Rasse.
The Nazis brought out a book called The Jews Are Looking at You, in which Chaplin was described as a disgusting Jewish acrobat. A friend of Chaplin came across a copy in Berlin.
And I thought, well, he ought to have a look at this. And I sent him a copy. Now, in all the years, Charlie often sent me Christmas cards, telegrams, telephone calls. But he only sent me one letter, and it was a short letter thanking for that book. And I always think that it may well have contributed to his resolve to make the great dictator.
Mussolini also disapproved of Chaplin and would ban his films. Chaplin visited Venice on his European tour, expecting to meet the dictator. The meeting never happened, but he would be brilliantly parodied a few years later in The Great Dictator.
He's coming, quick. Give me a flower. A flower. Remember, at all times you must be above him, before him. Entering or leaving, you must be first. Hello, Hinky!
One of the great moments in The Great Dictator is the casting of Jack Oakie as Mussolini.
I thought the public extremely enthusiastic on your arrival.
Sure. They like to see new faces.
Jack Oakie comes out on the balcony and struts and sticks out his chin, and by God, there's Mussolini. So it was a masterful job of casting on the part of Chaplin.
You cannot have treated the bacterium people this way! I'll take the bacterium people and I'll tear them apart like that! Look, listen, please! Look, what are you doing? Tell me yourself! That's an insult to the people! Don't the better spaghetti! It's spaghetti! He either side of the treaty or we have a war! Oh!
But before satirizing the dictators, Chaplin would turn his attention to the problems plaguing America in the 1930s. Strikes, lockouts, unemployment. The Ford factories brought out troops to deal with strikers. Henry Ford supported Hitler and was both anti-Semitic and anti-union. When Chaplin made his first overtly political film, The Big Boss bore a strong resemblance to Henry Ford.
Hey! Quit stalling. Get back to work. Go on.
Henry Ford had invented the assembly line, which was the trigger for Chaplin's satire.
Attention, foreman. Trouble on bench 5. Check on the nut tighteners. Nuts coming through loose on bench 5. Attention, foreman.
I thought Modern Times was the greatest movie I'd ever seen up till that point, and as a matter of fact, I think maybe I still do. And the whole idea of attacking capitalism, not only from an economic and social point of view, but from an intensely human point of view. What he was talking about was people becoming a cog, becoming part of machinery, because we're so dependent on it. That is the movie where a red flag falls off a truck and he's walking down the street and a parade comes in behind him and the cops then come in and beat the hell out of him. Brilliant, brilliant, brilliant ideas and, God, the execution.
There was a revolutionary feeling growing, and people who had been respectably middle class were actually breaking into bakeries and stealing bread. It was extreme.
The violence of industrial relations was also extreme. While in Germany, life was being transformed. Once Hitler had come to power, people accepted the supremacy of the state over the individual. Women were allotted a secondary role, while men were trained for war. Hitler tackled unemployment with huge construction projects, like these pioneer motorways.
There was an admiration for Hitler because we hadn't seen his evil things yet. They hadn't begun to manifest. We saw that he helped cure their inflation and put the people to work, and he had all the young men marching around with shovels over their shoulders instead of rifles, And I don't think that anyone really wanted a dictator in our country, but when we looked at Hitler, we saw maybe something like this could get us out of our depression.
These rallies at Nuremberg, Hitler told the world, were for peace and freedom.
And I thought it was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. Never seen anything as wonderful. And I screamed with the best of them, you know. Heil, Heil, or whatever. And I don't feel guilty about that. How can I? I was 11. What I found extraordinary worthy was the theater.
In the mid-30s, political leaders all over the world expressed their admiration for the astonishing achievements of Adolf Hitler. The anti-Jewish boycott would become an important feature of Chaplin's film. The barber has lost his memory and knows nothing of the dictator's rise to power. The word Jew was hardly ever mentioned in American films.
You leave that alone. Don't be silly. I'm not silly. I appreciate that.
When you talk to me, hail Hinkle and salute.
Who are you, anyway? I'll show you who I am.
The emigration began. many Jews set out for the land of opportunity.
Our unemployment problem was transferred to the United States from foreign lands. And if we had refused admission to the 16,500,000 foreign-born in our midst, there would be no serious unemployment problem to harass us.
The German-American Bund held mass rallies in Madison Square Garden before audiences of 20,000. They followed exactly the Nazi Party line. Anti-Semitism in America was so rife, there was every chance of fascism succeeding in the United States. Over 100 organizations put out anti-Semitic literature like this. No wonder the subject became hard to discuss.
I know among other Jews, some of them thought that it was making waves. Shouldn't talk about those things, because it was certainly a feeling among many in the what you might call the Jewish establishment that such things you didn't mention. It would just bring more trouble.
There were congressional investigations into the Jewish influence on motion pictures. It's incredible, incredible what went on in this country.
The producers, if you check the films that were made in the 30s until late in the 30s, they were very wary of rocking the boat because they were still making money in Germany. They were making money in Italy, and the bottom line was profit and really not principle.
Hitler in particular saw every American film he could.
War ein Filmenthusiast. Das war für ihn die schönste Sache. Auch der schönste Zeitvertreib, den hatte. Der Bengal Lancers, das hatte er sehr gern gehabt. Und dann hatte gerne Greta Garbo-Filme, selbstverständlich. Die hätte er gerne empfangen wie einen Staatsmann in Berlin.
Propaganda Minister Dr. Goebbels would have preferred German films for the German public, but they loved American films as much as Hitler. Goebbels ensured a steady supply. Hitler would see something like The Hound of the Baskervilles and would even record his opinion. The ones he disliked were often banned.
Louis B. Mayer of MGM would actually run those films with the Nazi German consul and was willing to take out the things that the Nazi objected to.
The problem with Hollywood, which I've often said to my friends, is that we're living in the company of cowards. They won't stand up for anything. They pretend to stand up for it, but when the money is down, they fade out.
Walter Wanger made a film called Blockade, which was self-evidently about the Spanish Civil War, but it never mentioned Spain or Franco or the Civil War, because it was felt that this would complicate acceptability in many countries.
Henry Fonda played the lead in Blockade.
And I remember the last sentence of the picture. He turned directly to camera and looking out at us with those great Fonda eyes, said, "Where is the conscience of the world?"
The Anschluss. Germany unites with Austria, 1938. Hitler last saw Vienna as a poverty-stricken youth.
Als Führer und Kanzler der deutschen Nation und des Reichs melde ich vor der deutschen Geschichte nunmehr den Eintritt meiner Heimat in das Deutsche Reich.
It was 3 days after the Anschluss, and I was walking in the street with my best friend, and came upon this group, a number of middle-aged ladies and gentlemen, all obviously upper-class citizens. And they were on their knees and cleaning the pavement with toothbrushes. There were lots of Viennese in this group, laughing and taunting them, and it was You know, it was really something that could have been out of The Great Dictator, you're quite right. Because one almost laughed, it was so terrible.
Against a background of aggression and appeasement, Chaplin announced his film in October 1938. The British, anxious not to upset Hitler, said they would ban it. To general astonishment, Chaplin went ahead.
Every one of my friends, many of whom were Jewish, like myself, felt that a David had arisen, a comic David, to fight Goliath. And we could only be happy.
Kristallnacht, November the 9th, 1938. The Nazis unleashed a wave of violence against the Jews.
Wenn es dem internationalen Finanzjudentum in und außerhalb Europas gelingen sollte, die Völker noch einmal in einen Weltkrieg zu stürzen, dann wird das Ergebnis nicht die Bolschewisierung der Erde und damit der Sieg des Judentums sein, sondern die Vernichtung der jüdischen Rasse in Europa.
There was a big movement afoot among Jewish producers in Hollywood to discourage Chaplin's film. A lot of them went to him and said, look, Charlie, you're going to make it terribly hard for our people over there. You know, it's going to make Hitler furious. And Charlie would say, well, I don't give a damn if he's furious. He can't be any worse than he is, can he, you know? He even felt that there would be trouble with getting a release. They were saying, this is a disaster, Charlie, you know, not just for the Jews, but for the American foreign policy and so forth. Charlie was beginning to get really scared. Roosevelt got word of this, and he sent Harry Hopkins out to talk to Charlie. And Hopkins said, look, Charlie, the president is all for this. He said, you don't have to worry about their boycotting release. He'll see that it's released. He feels that this is a very important thing and that you must go ahead and not listen to any of these people who are trying to discourage you.
In April 1939, Hitler celebrated his 50th birthday with one of the largest military parades in history. For the first time since 1919, tanks rolled through Berlin. Chaplin celebrated his birthday by working on his script. He said he wanted a Berlin premiere for the Führer's benefit. Chaplin saw the Russians as the only hope to defeat Nazism. But to his horror, in August, the unthinkable happened. The Nazis signed a pact with the Soviet Union.
I believe the great phrase was, Russia is not going to pull England and France's coals out of the fire. That was the great rationalization for the pact. So the particular atmosphere that I ran into was of tragedy, a calamity, the end of the world.
The victory parade in Warsaw. Germany and Russia have carved up Poland. England and France have declared war on Hitler. As Chaplin began work, his brother Sidney filmed him. Sound equipment was installed and a ghetto set built at his Hollywood studio. The finance for the film came not from the other Hollywood studios, but entirely from Chaplin himself. Filming in the ghetto began on September the 9th, 1939, 6 days after the outbreak of the Second World War, in conditions of strict secrecy. Unknown to Chaplin, events for Jews were worse than even he portrayed them. Nonetheless, he took great risks with his film.
It's a very daring thing to have done, really, to satirize the Jews and Hitler and Mussolini and make a sad comedy. It's almost tragic, you know. It's the comedy element. You find yourself laughing at something that you don't want to laugh at.
Before we take you down, you'll finish this. Here. Go on, paint that.
Even though this was a comedy, Chaplin forced his audience to face the Nazi brutality. Chaplin was proud of the equipment he was using for the first time.
So he called up a dear friend of his, Louis Milestone. He said, "You got to come down here. Something I have to show you. It's incredibly important. You have to get down there." So Milestone came down. My father said, look at this, look at this. And Milestone saw it, and he had a crane, I guess, that lifted the camera and moved it over. He said, what do you think of that? And Milestone said, "Charlie, they've been doing that for years."
In his own studio, Chaplin was also a dictator, but usually a benevolent one.
He always could divorce the little man, as he called himself, from his everyday living, because he was so entirely different in person than anything that he did on the screen. But with the great dictator, he became more and more important to himself. I used to laugh so, because the moment he put on the uniform, he'd smooth down his flat tummy and preen a little bit, and always looking in the mirror just to see that everything was just so, he was not a vain man, but he certainly was during the making.
His Excellency is about to descend the stairs.
His agent.
Oh, Your Excellency! Oh, are you hurt? Oh,
Strap! Da Fluten, Bremen, da Cheese Kraken!
the Fluten, the banana!
Da Fluten, da Banana!
Du, das kleine Banana!
Da Banana stummt ein Strepp mit seiner und ein Sing da Banana!
The banana!
Da dicke Buben ist...
That was what was so interesting. Everybody that was in the film, that was in a uniform, that was important with Charlie, they lived their part, and they thought it was simply wonderful.
He's going to take Austerlitz.
I can't believe it.
This ain't a Strapnitz. You can't believe it. Much den Strupp, the big Buben.
Not Your Excellency.
You let him steal a march on us.
No,
Den Buben, you can't believe it.
If he didn't like something, he'd do it again and do it again. And then come back to it a week later and do it again. Which he could do because it was his money. But he was a perfectionist, which is marvelous, but very few people get to do that.
He felt very pompous, very grand, and the whole time he was doing it, he was just a different person.
I'm surrounded by nothing but incompetent, stupid, sterile stenographers.
I'll get you a pen.
Don't bother. I won't send it. Get out, get out, get out!
Neither Chaplin's imagination nor the resources of Hollywood could duplicate Albert Speer's grandiose design for the Reichschancellery. But in photos of Hitler's study, Chaplin noticed something which he seized upon. Others claimed it was their idea, but its origins can be found in a home movie taken as early as 1928. Chaplin is fooling for visitors, as he so often did, when he suddenly came up with this strange idea involving the globe and a German helmet. It summed up perfectly the Führer's godlike ambition. But, said picture-goer, by the time Chaplin finishes his picture, we may all have forgotten who Hitler was.
It's the stormtroopers. They're after you.
You better get up on the roof.
No, stay here.
Come on, they'll kill you.
No, stay and fight.
Don't be a fool. You want to be murdered? Get onto the roof, quick.
Come on, come on.
Bravely, Chaplin turns his camera away from the obvious and shows us this symbolic shot.
Here we are. Smash in the door. Come on. I wear the bomb. Let go.
There goes the barber shop.
Never mind, we can start again. We can go to Austerlitz, that's still a free country.
The main filming was no sooner finished than Hitler launched his blitzkrieg. France fell in a month, Denmark in a matter of hours. Chaplin was so appalled, he considered withholding the film. This newsreel shows Hitler at the moment he heard of the fall of France. Chaplin said, "He is a horrible menace to civilization rather than someone to laugh at."
I felt that this was a terrible thing to make a comic film about him. There are two things which are very dangerous to associate humor with people like that and to diminish them.
Comedy is the greatest way to attack anything like a totalitarian regime. They can't stand it, and that gives the people a chance to laugh too. You can't go on being grim forever. There are people who came out of Buchenwald, who came out because of their sense of humor. Courage doesn't do it, laughs do.
This was to have been part of Chaplin's original ending, which he'd begun work on months before. Soldiers discarding their weapons and uniting in a folk dance. The sequence involved hundreds of actors and technicians. Here, Chaplin tries out the opening of the sequence, his own arrival. He rehearses obsessively the same gesture over and over again, trying to perfect it, while all the time the camera turns. He repeats it with stand-ins so he can observe it from the camera. But he knows the sequence is not working. He vents his frustration on an assistant director, for he knows something more fundamental is wrong. In this form, he would abandon the sequence. Instead, he realized his ending would have to focus much more on his own speech, which he would deliver not as the dictator, not as the barber, but as himself, Charlie Chaplin. Hitler's attack on France gave him the impetus to rewrite the speech, which would be a plea for peace, a plea for sanity. And he was 458 days into the picture before he was ready to shoot it. At dawn, on the very day Chaplin was delivering his plea for freedom, Hitler swept into Paris to view his latest conquest. A carpet of flowers greeted the Führer when he returned to Berlin. He was at the zenith of his power, having achieved his victories with incredible speed. Said Chaplin's son, "If only Charlie could move as fast as Adolf Hitler." But Chaplin was still not happy with his film and was reshooting yet again. The ghetto set had been torn down, so he rebuilt it. He would spend months reshooting, re-editing and re-recording before finally, after 559 days of work, the report sheet showed no rushes, no shooting, no recording. He was ready to show his picture to the world. The film opened in 2 Broadway theaters simultaneously, attended by a crowd so full of celebrities, it was commemorated in a special cartoon.
He was going to show up. We knew that. There was an enormous amount of publicity, and the crowds in front of the theater were tremendous. Received an absolute ovation. People stood, cheered, called for Chaplin.
Here, this man had come out against Hitler. It was as if the greatest angel in the calendar of saints and angels had suddenly taken a stand.
It was such a brilliant tour de force that I think it blinded people as to what it was saying or not saying.
When you think of a movie that begins with Big Bertha defecating and ending up with that speech to camera and the first time he had spoken, when you think of the span emotionally that movie covers, it's a miracle.
You must speak. I can't. You must. It's our only hope. Hope.
I mean, that ending doesn't come as an abrupt thing. He builds it so carefully, prepares you so carefully for your own feelings to be involved on another level. I'm not saying that laughter isn't a feeling. It's a tremendous feeling. But to get rid of the laughter feeling and slowly let this other emotion well up.
I'm sorry, but I don't want to be an emperor. That's not my business. I don't want to rule or conquer anyone. I should like to help everyone if possible. Jew, Gentile, black man, white. We all want to help one another. Human beings are like that. We want to live by each other's happiness, not by each other's misery. We don't want to hate and despise one another. In this world, there's room for everyone, and the good earth is rich and can provide for everyone.
I wept at the ending. It was something to me that had to be said. If it was inartistic, it was inartistic. I don't care. Nothing has to be perfect.
It seemed mawkish and maudlin at the time, but in the context of the nuclear age, I think it has great resonance and great power.
The way of life can be free and beautiful, but we have lost the way. Greed has poisoned men's souls, has barricaded the world with hate, has goose-stepped us into misery and bloodshed. We have developed speed, but we have shut ourselves in. Machinery that gives abundance has left us in want. Our knowledge has made us cynical, our cleverness hard and unkind. We think too much and feel too little. More than machinery, we need humanity.
So at the end of this speech, he dares to remind you that you don't have to go on killing. You don't have to be a totalitarian. You can make do with the worst people in the world. Somehow you must. And that's what he did. And there are a lot of people with violence in their soul resented the fact that someone wanted peace.
But Chaplin said he would never have made the great dictator had he known the full horror of Hitler's crimes. Millions were grateful that he did.
Chaplin brings us to tears because he reminds us of the potential of mankind lighting a lantern and keeping it aside while mankind goes on destroying itself, and being there when the war is over to relight the lantern and to give us hopes for tomorrow.
At the height of the Blitz on London, the film opened to an ecstatic reaction. The best propaganda film since the start of the war for the British people, said one. The best heartener we could have. The film was to go on to become Chaplin's biggest moneymaker, yet it was banned across Europe, in parts of South America, and even Ireland. But did Hitler see it?
At the end of the war, I was in Berlin. I was in charge of the gathering the photographic evidence for the war crime trial that was being prepared in Nuremberg. But in the course of it, I looked up the file on what films Hitler had ordered to run. And this is the true. He ordered The Great Dictator, and then he ordered it a day or so after again.
Es ist mir klipp und klar gewesen, dass der sich das vorführen hat lassen und dann auch gelacht haben wird. Wissen Sie, der Hitler war auch schlau. Und ich kann mir auch sehr gut vorstellen, dass er über diesen Film von Charlie Chaplin, wo der mit dem Mussolini auf zwei Stühlen sitzt beim Friseur und dann hochgekurbelt wird er sicher sehr herzlich gelacht haben. Er war ja kein Kostverächter. Er konnte über solche Sachen lachen. Nicht? Im engeren Kreis wird er das nie öffentlich oder so.
The German public did not see the film during the war, but the German army did, once. In occupied Belgrade, as a 17-year-old working in film dispatch, Nikola Radosevich discovered a print.
Wir wollten machen kulturelle Sabotage. Ich gehöre zum blauen Band, wie habe Sie gesagt. Wir sind nie mit Waffen gegen die deutschen Soldaten etwas gemacht. Nein, nur etwas mit Spaß. Wir wollten, dass der Hitler hört, was denkt über ihn Charlie Chaplin.
Nikola substituted the Chaplin film for the German feature the soldiers were to see.
Bei Beginnung von Vorführung Leute haben nicht gleichzeitig bemerkt, was ist denn. Aber nach den 40 Minuten oder 45 Minuten ist einer von SS-Mann hatte mit Gewehr erschissen in Wand, in weiche Wand. Und alle anderen sind durch Türe schnell rausgegangen, weil wollte nicht mehr dort sein, weil passiert etwas gegen die Hitler.
1945, the last shots of Hitler before his suicide. Hitler's world lay in ruins. When the Reich Chancellery was captured by the Russians, they found nothing but rubble. But one object remained intact. With The Great Dictator, Chaplin had strengthened millions through the power of laughter at a time when madness and darkness covered the world. Despite his plea for sanity, the political climate of the McCarthy era forced him into exile. In 1952, he was locked out of the United States. But one country would welcome him back.
Now the train draws into Waterloo Station, only a short distance from Chaplin's actual birthplace. And what a great reception greets him and his family from the thousands who have gathered to welcome him home. When he left America a week ago, Charlie was worried in case our affection for him had dimmed. Londoners show him now that he need not have worried. We can never forget him or the laughter he brought into our lives. Throughout the world, he is loved for his genius. Chaplin was not born great, yet in a lifetime crowded with laughter and tears, he has achieved an everlasting greatness.